Hello everyone! We've got a special video coming up for you in a minute because I'm joined in conversation by Professor Robert Bartlett of the University of St Andrews. Professor Bartlett has got a special place in my heart as a student of history because it was his book Conquest, Colonisation and Cultural Change which first got me inspired to learn more about the Middle Ages, and he was also one of my lecturers back when I was at St Andrews University as an undergraduate. So I hope you enjoy our conversation on knowledge in the Middle Ages. Here it is. Well, a very warm welcome to Robert Bartlett, who joins me now. Hello, Robert.
Hello.
Brilliant. Well, we're going to spend the next 50 minutes to an hour or so talking about all things medieval and with the topic of medieval knowledge in mind. So we're going to start very broad, I think, and then we'll see where the conversation takes us and narrow things down, I imagine, too. By the end of the hour, we will have covered a lot of material, undoubtedly. So, Robert, the Middle Ages are often seen and traditionally called the Dark Ages, the period of history where not much happened and not many people knew what was going on. So the question I want to start with is, how did knowledge and learning survive in this period?
Okay, well, we'll start with those two terms, medieval knowledge. And first of all, of course, we've got to admit that they are very broad terms. The Middle Ages covers about 1,000 years of European history, say 500 to 1500. And we'd be very surprised, I think, if there were not changes in that period. So it's worth making that point straight away. Although I also think, and I'd be willing to argue, that there are certain common features over that 1,000-year period. So we can get onto that. And then, of course, knowledge itself is a very broad term, isn't it? And it ranges from things which I think we'll be talking more about, like book learning, things that you study, and how did people study, and what institutions of education were, things like this, which really tends to rely a lot on the written word. But knowledge, of course, goes well beyond that. There's practical knowledge as well, and one wouldn't want to underestimate the amount of practical, technical knowledge there was in the medieval period. And we have, particularly towards the later part of the period, technical inventions, such things as windmills, the clock, glasses, spectacles for looking at things, which I find extremely useful, and so forth. So you've got that practical, technical side as well, and that's knowledge. Of course, that's knowledge. But we're looking at something, I think, more to do with learning and education. The Dark Ages is a funny term. It's usually used now for the earlier part of the Middle Ages, after the fall of Rome. And some people are rather kind of crusading about it, if that's the right word, that they want to get rid of it because, it suggests barbarism and ignorance and the rest of it. But I think it really has a place if you look at it in a slightly different way. If you say, okay, Dark Ages doesn't mean that the sky was dark and people, went around, grubbing in the filth and stuff like that. It means we don't know very much about it. That's why it's dark. And if you look, particularly in the case of Britain, but also in other parts of Europe as well, what we know about Europe in the early Middle Ages compared with what we know later, or what we, in theory, could know about the ancient world, then it's a reasonable term, really. I suppose what I'd say about the features that are common to it throughout that 1,000-year period, there's no doubt about it. It's a generalization, but it's a valid generalization that this is the time when the Christian church dominates learning and education in a way that it clearly, obviously did not do before that in the ancient world, but hasn't actually done in quite the same way since. I mean, it's been a very long and gradual process whereby the church has been disentangled from that almost monopoly position over learning and education. And in some ways, of course, it wasn't really completed. Also, in some places, it hasn't been completed, but in many places, it's only in the 19th, 20th centuries that really there's been this disentanglement. There's a slightly earlier movement, associated with what people call the Renaissance, the 15th, 16th centuries, in which lay people, non-clergy, become much more significant. in the world of learning and education, and that in particular the secular aristocracy, people who are not clergy but are powerful and upper class people, begin to get book learning in a way. That's very important. But basically, that 1,000-year period is one where the church dominates, and that has several consequences.
Let's start off then with the church, and in particular in the early part of the Middle Ages. And would you be able to speak a bit about the inheritance of the Roman Empire? Because I think personally, in my own study of the medieval period, very often it's a difficult period to dip into because it's so foreign from the world that we live in today and so distant in so many different ways. And sometimes we can start off looking at the Crusades or Norman England, for example. But really, the inheritance of Rome seems to me to be such an important underpinning factor throughout the whole of the early Middle Ages, certainly. Would you mind just talking a bit about that and perhaps the role of the church in preserving that inheritance as well, please?
Well, Gibbon famously said that the church was the ghost of the Roman Empire sitting on its grave. And of course, Gibbon was kind of rather skeptical about the church, but that picture that it was inherited, Christian church inherited so much from Rome. It grew up in the Roman Empire. And what's very important, I think, is that in the late Roman Empire, the Christian church achieved something like a monopoly of religious authority. It hadn't been the Christian church had been going for several hundred years. By that time, it had been persecuted. But in the period from Constantine onwards, from the 4th century, within 100 or 200 years, it assumes a dominance, which it doesn't lose for a very, very long time. And some of the obvious pieces of that inheritance are the fact that the church in Western and Central Europe, as distinct from the Greek East, is Latin speaking. The Bible is in Latin. The church services are in Latin. So you've got a linguistic inheritance there, which is the first thing. And you've got a kind of conduit for some of the written work of the Roman Empire. If we're talking about Latin Europe, that's the part where the Pope is important, where the liturgy and learning is in Latin. Western Europe and then later Central Europe, then they had not got much access to Greek civilization in the original language. They do have access to a large amount of the Roman past. And that means things like some of the, like Virgil, some of the great poems are transmitted from the pagan period. So there is a pagan Roman literature that is still available in that early period. And then you've got the form that Christianity took. The bishops who rule the cities. This isn't so true in Britain and Ireland, because Britain and Ireland had a slightly different history. But in places like France and Spain and Italy, those are Roman cities. They're poorer and smaller than they were in the time of the Roman Empire, but there's a continuity. And they're often dominated by their bishops and the clergy of the great churches. And that's continuous from the Roman period. The saints that are worshipped in those places are often continuous with the saints from the Roman period. So you've got a real continuity there. And
sorry to interrupt you on that point, Robert, but just about that continuity, how far did the pagan inheritance of Rome pose a problem for the medieval church, in the sense that Europe was the hierarchy of the church, the bishops, the papacy, etc., were attempting to Christianize the world around them, yes. But yet to an extent they were relying on the scholarship of people, for example, like Aristotle, who had not been Christian at all, nor had they been brought up in a Christian world. So how did those two, how easy was it for those two worlds to combine in knowledge?
I distinguish over different periods. You mentioned Aristotle. Aristotle is not really known very well in the early Middle Ages. They know his basic logic. He comes in later, and I'll come back to that in just a second. But the first stage was for a decision to be made about how the church in its two forms, the bishops who ran the cities and the monasteries. We should mention monasticism because the early medieval church was highly monastic, and that's really that's where the books were, and that's where the people were who were writing and thinking about literature and religion. They had to make up their mind how they were going to deal with these clearly non-Christian writers. And from quite early on, the general position was that they were not in themselves harmful and dangerous. They had to be clearly regarded as wrong in terms of their religious beliefs, but that didn't mean you couldn't study them and get stuff out of them. Augustine, one of the great church fathers, did this very early on. They called it spoiling the Egyptians, which is a reference to the Bible, in which the children of Israel leave Egypt and they pinch some stuff from the Egyptians as they go. And the idea was that, yes, these people are not Christian, they belong to a pre-Christian past, but they have stuff that we can find useful, literature and learning and so on. So that was the first stage. And in fact, it's very clear that if you look at the Carolingian period, which roughly for this purpose is the 9th century after the reign of Charlemagne, that was a great period of copying out Latin texts. That's when the monasteries are really working away. We're talking about thousands of manuscripts. And that's when it's almost like a bottleneck. If the monks copied out Latin literature in that period, it has survived to the day. If it didn't get copied, the chances of it surviving are very slight. So there's some very famous things that only kind of scrape through in just one or two copies and so on, so which weren't known for most of the Middle Ages. So there's that. But then if we turn to the other point you were making about Aristotle comes in the 12th and 13th centuries, translations from the Greek into Latin, so that people, in the learned people of Western Europe, can now read Aristotle in the language they know, which is Latin. And it presented several enormous problems in terms of what Aristotle said and what the Bible said. And some of them are very, they're almost contemporary issues or recent issues, because of course in the 20th, not now, but in the 20th century, cosmologists, people who thought about, and astronomers, there was a big debate about whether the universe had always existed, our universe now we're talking about, or whether it had started with the Big Bang. And there was a division of opinion about that in the late 20th century. And that's exactly the same division that you find in the 12th and 13th centuries when people start reading Aristotle, because Aristotle and many other Greek thinkers believed that the universe had continued forever, that there was no creation. And of course, if you've got the Bible and if you've got the book of Genesis, you have to believe that there was a creation and that there was nothing before. So you've got really big issues. And of course, sometimes that matters very much. And sometimes people say, well, we're actually reading Aristotle for other reasons. We're reading him for his fantastic analytical powers. We're reading him because he talks about animals and the different kinds of animals. We're reading him because he's a philosopher and he discusses what is a cause, things like that. So they're reading Aristotle for that. They know that. But there are definitely moments where the two things just grind together. And in the University of Paris, which was the most important university in Northern Europe, outside Italy, in the 13th century, there's actually a very long list drawn up of errors, many of which are errors that Aristotle thought were correct, right? So you do get, it's not harmonious, but there's never going to be a complete suppression of the non-Christian past, either the Roman past that was immediately prior to the early Middle Ages, or to this new material coming in from the Greeks and so
on. Can we also talk a bit about the legacy of the influence of other civilizations outside of Europe, but on the periphery of Europe, you might say, but the Byzantine Empire, which was a massive force in preserving the Eastern legacy of ancient Rome, and also the Islamic world. What were the ways that you would say that those civilizations preserved knowledge and interacted with Western medieval Europe?
Well, the Islamic world is fundamentally important for the intellectual development of Christian Europe, fundamentally, because by a rather circuitous route, ancient Greek philosophy and science, which did not come through to Western Europe in the early Middle Ages, did go to the Islamic world. It went via strange routes. It was translated from Greek into Syriac and from Syriac into Arabic. And then in the period, the booming period of the Abbasids and so on, when really the Islamic world was the dominant force in the world, after China maybe, you have people who study that stuff and develop it and analyze it and write about it. These are writing in Arabic mainly, right? So there's a huge reservoir of ancient Greek science and philosophy, many of it already translated into Arabic, with Arabic commentators sitting there very close to Western Europe. And at a certain point, that material comes to be translated into Latin, the learned language of Western Europe, and begins to be available. And that's what happens in the 12th and 13th centuries. And it's a huge transfer of material. And there are certain places, it's obviously places which are multilingual, that are the transmission points. A famous example is Toledo in Spain. And Spain, of course, was the Iberian Peninsula was half Christian and half Muslim throughout the Middle Ages from the time of the Muslim conquest in 711. And so you have people there who know Latin, they know whatever Romance language is coming up, forms of Spanish. There's a large Jewish population, they know Hebrew, and there are, of course, lots of people who know Arabic. So you get all those languages being taught, and it's recognized. There's a tomb of one of the Spanish kings has his name and an inscription in four different languages on each side of his tomb. It's a multilingual world, and people know that. They go there. People go from elsewhere, from Italy, from England. People go to Spain because they know that's where you can get the new philosophy and science. And there's obviously, it's one of those things where it's a push and a pull, right? I mean, if that material had been sitting there for a while, but it was only when people began to really want it. And so when you've got that stuff translated, and it's translated over the course of the 12th and 13th centuries, and sometimes it's translated and retranslated as they get better. Sometimes things that are translated from the Arabic are then translated directly from the Greek. And this material comes into the world of learning in Western Europe, in Latin Europe, just as a new form of educational institution is developing, the university. And of course, one would guess that those two things are connected, because round about 1200, you have the birth of the European university. And once it forms gradually in places, the famous places of Paris and Bologna, but there's others as well. Oxford is an early one. So you've got a new institutional form. All the things we know and love, like exams and marking and things like that, are created at that time, right? And at the same time, the syllabus is changing. So it's not just the new institutional form. There's a syllabus which is mainly this stuff coming in. And Aristotle is the big name. I mean, the syllabus almost becomes, the art syllabus almost becomes Aristotle by a certain stage. And as I've said earlier, there's some readjustments have to be made. It can't be taken on whole. But by the time you get to 1300, that's what is being taught to the boys. It was all boys, teenage boys who were going into these universities. And, there was something, by the end of the Middle Ages, there were something like 80 universities in Latin Christendom, and they were all teaching this kind of stuff. So you could have, and because of the Latin, the Latin's rather strange. It's the learned language. It's nobody's birth language, right? You don't grow up learning Latin from your mum. You learn it at a certain point. But on the other hand, you do learn it if you're going to go into the church or into learning. And that means that learning is very, very international. You can go from Ireland to Poland to Spain, and you can talk Latin to the learned people you meet. And nowadays, of course, the equivalent is English. No one would have believed that in the Middle Ages, this language in this, not even in an island, but part of an island, a small part of the world. That was going to be the big international language. No one would have believed that.
Sorry to interrupt again. You mentioned one of your in one of your series, one of your programs, Medieval Minds. There's the example of Daniel of Morley in the 11th century who travels from England to Spain to go and seek out knowledge. He's an example, presumably, of someone who's learning internationally and would have spoke Latin and interacted in Latin.
Yeah. No, that's a perfect example. I mean, and he's drawn there because he's heard it has the reputation of being, this is where the place where you can get science and the new science and philosophy, right? They know it's there. Obviously, this is a big, when I said at the beginning, the Middle Ages is 1,000 years, that's quite a long period. This transformation in the 12th and 13th centuries really means that the world of learning and education in the second half of the Middle Ages is very, very different from that in the first half of the Middle Ages. That's a very big difference.
One question I want to ask next is, how does that sharing of knowledge with the Islamic world and with the Byzantine world, with those in medieval Europe, how does that coexist in periods of hostility? So in contrast, we've got the period of the Crusades, where massive holy war between the East and the West and the Holy Land. And when the Crusades travelled through the Byzantine Empire, they were often very hostile to it, resulting in the sack of Constantinople in 1204. There are many examples of the sharing of knowledge once the Crusaders were settled in the Middle East. But how would you say that coexisted, the sharing of knowledge with that hostility and with that desire to crusade and go and spread Christianity and conquer other people groups?
Well, it did coexist. That's the thing. I mean, if you think of Spain, I mean, in the 12th and 13th centuries, simultaneously, the Christian kingdoms are expanding at the expense of the Muslim kingdoms in the Iberian Peninsula. Not continuously, there's to and fro and so forth. But in the end, the Muslim part of the Iberian Peninsula, by the time you get to, say, 1300, is quite small in comparison with what it had been 200 years earlier. So there's been this expansion. And one of the things that happens there is because there's such a large Muslim population in these Christian kingdoms, they tend to have to develop certain ways of tolerating and dealing with those people. So there's actually, it would be a bit, romantic perhaps to say religious toleration, but it's certainly the case that Muslims and Jews have maintained their religious communities under Christian rulership, not in the long run, but at first they do. And that means, of course, you've got toing and froing between people of different languages. And that's why, if you are interested in what is available in Arabic, that's somewhere. I mean, sometimes these translations were made via 3 languages rather than 2. The Arabic might be translated into Romance or Hebrew or something, and then into Latin. So you've got this multi-ethnic and multilingual world, and it's not that there is harmony and convivencia, they sometimes call it, the Spanish thing, living together. There is living together, not always very happy living together, but there is living together. The crusading states are a little bit different because, of course, they were quite a long way away from Western Europe, and some people, it's a controversial issue, I suppose. Some people would regard them as colonial establishments, the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the other Crusader states, and you never had Christian immigration on the scale that you had in Spain and Portugal. So the transformation of those areas eventually into Christian majority countries didn't happen, obviously. And indeed, the states only survived for 200 years maximum. But you still find a little bit of toing and froing in terms of intellectual activity and translations. Spain is the big one. The Byzantine Empire is a very interesting case because, of course, that's where Greek has survived as the main language, right? It's a continuous language, so that there was a transmission of Greek material in a way that there wasn't in the West. And one of the things that seems to me quite interesting is that the 12th and 13th century, the people who were translating, who were going to Spain and looking for things, they're translating sometimes from the Greek or the Arabic. what are they looking for? They're looking for Greek science and philosophy. They're not going for Homer. They're not going for the Athenian dramatists. They're not going for the things that are now very big in modern conceptions of what the literary legacy of Greece was. And you only find, I think, really significant waves of translation from the Greek and Greek texts coming into Western Europe, probably as late as the 15th century, when for the first, the Byzantine Empire is actually being destroyed. By the 15th century, it is destroyed in the 15th century. It ceases to exist. And many, many Greek scholars, then come to Italy and places, and they bring with them texts that have been known in the Byzantine Empire, but had not been known in the West. A perfect example is Herodotus. And Herodotus, the great sort of historian or anthropologist or liar, depending on how you want to characterize it. I don't know. Anyway, he's a really standard text in the if you're looking at the roots of Western learning, and not known at all in the medieval West until the 15th century when he's come. So that's a slightly, it's almost like an untapped reservoir in Byzantium until quite late in the Middle Ages.
It's coming back to me now. I remember this point from one of your lectures when I was at when I was at St Andrews myself. Coming back to me, it's reviving this knowledge which has been long residing in my mind. Brilliant. I think let's move on now. We've talked about the broader concept of how knowledge has been shared and preserved. Can we talk for a bit about how a person in the early Middle Ages may well have viewed themselves and the world around them?
If they were at all educated, they would have a picture of the world. The world consisted of 3 continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa, around which there was an ocean. And that is actually true, isn't it? That's
fair enough. It is, yeah.
Yeah. Obviously, they weren't familiar with different extremities of that world, Southern Africa and so on and so forth. But that picture was right. And then over the course of time, there was more and more exploration of parts of that world. I mean, we've got particularly in the 14th and 15th, I beg your pardon, the 13th and 14th centuries, when you have the Mongol Empire. And the Mongol Empire was rather, it sounds almost paradoxical, right? Because of course the Mongols did destroy and kill. They were, a ravaging, conquering force. But they also created an enormous state, I suppose, or a area of political control that ran from China to the edge of Poland and Hungary at one point, right? So it's an enormous space which allowed, for a period anyway, contact between Europeans and particularly the East, China and India. So we have people traveling in the 14th century to try. So the picture of people's, educated people's picture of the world was opening up. You have in the 14th century, for example, Franciscans going from Europe, and they found an archbishopric in Beijing, right? So you have some inscriptions and stuff from that period. There's a man who travels down to India and is very interested in all sorts of things. He notices for the fact that all Indians have umbrellas. He's kind of interested in like daily life. So there's that change in the parameters of the world. And Marco Polo is a famous example, of course. If you're thinking about people who are not literate, which would be the majority of the population, then their knowledge of the cosmos and the world would be rather different and rather limited, I think. You wouldn't have so much. You might have some foreign travel, but not this picture of the wider world that's opening up. And when you talk about the natural and the supernatural, I mean, it's clearly the case. If you read chronicles, annals, stories, the material you read, you've got access there, sometimes a little indirect, sometimes misunderstood by the literate, but you've got access there to a world in which there are very strange things at the edge of your ordinary everyday life. There are stories about green children who kind of seem to be living in caves, but maybe they're coming from the Antipodes. You don't quite you're not sure. There's an anchor that hangs down from the clouds because there's a ship up there. There's people who live in the sea, mermen and mermaids and so on. So that's a very there's so much of that stuff that I think you'd want to be careful. I think you'd want to say, okay, there's lots of that stuff. This is definitely aspects of the consciousness of people. It's real. But on the other hand, you wouldn't want to claim that the medieval mentality was in some way totally alien to our own, and that their humanity was different, because of course they're living people. They have the biological needs that we have. They have to feed. They fall in love. They have arguments. I mean, it's you don't want to make it too exotic and too alien. But on the other hand, you really can't deny that that's a common thread, a large thread in their strand. And that is even without turning to another huge area of the supernatural, which is the role of the saints, the cult of the saints, because Europe from the time of Constantine onwards was completely covered with these shrines where dead people were enshrined, where dead bodies were found, or where parts of bodies were enshrined, and those were believed to be places where you could go for supernatural help, particularly healing.
The Middle Ages is often a period which evokes the images of kings and barons and nobility and the church, which we've been discussing. Most often, most of the texts that we encounter either emerge from those places or written by churchmen and focus on kings and nobility.
Yes.
Do you think, or can you suggest to our audience, any places where we can get a glimpse into everyday life in this period, which is very difficult to understand compared to, say, much later on, after the Reformation, or even after the Inquisition? I suppose in the south of France there's Montaigu, isn't there, the study of the Inquisitor in the south of France, visiting and talking to people. Do we get that in the earlier Middle Ages, would you say?
Well, I can think of a couple of ways that you could try to get deeper into everyday life and the majority of the population. And one of them, just because I just mentioned it, is actually these accounts of miracles at shrines, because you're quite right that the writing narrative history tends to look at, written at the time, narrative history at the time tends to look at the very top strata of society. And it does talk about kings and battles and stuff, right? There's no question about it, it does. But if you turn to these accounts of miracles, the people who were looking after the shrine, the churchman who was looking after a shrine, and pilgrims came, or sick people came looking for healing, they wrote all that down. They wrote down what happened. And whether you believe it exactly as it was described or not doesn't really matter, because these are people from a very broad range of society: poor people, peasantry, many women, children. So you've got this slice of the population who are being recorded. And if you can go through that material carefully, and I'm talking about tens of thousands of stories of miracles, and it goes on right through the Middle Ages, right? You can do it through the whole Middle Ages, tens of thousands. They can be analyzed for what you might call social history and the history of mentality. You can do that. That's one way into this material. And then the other way, I suppose, is it's not so good, not so full of stories, but of course there are the nuts and bolts of the agrarian economy. There are accounts, there are lists of rentals, there are quarrels about duties, the lord-peasant relationship. There are legal records which start from probably 12th, 13th centuries. You get manorial records, you get all these things. They're not so much fun to read as accounts of supernatural healing and so on, but they actually do give you the nuts and bolts. And then I think the other place you could go, and this is, you want to be careful. There's an imaginative literature from the Middle Ages, a huge imaginative literature, particularly as the centuries wear on, the vernaculars, the non-Latin languages come in, French and German and English and Spanish and so on, Italian. All these languages begin to produce a literature of legend, story, satire, all sorts of literature. It gets richer and richer, and you can go there and you can find out something beyond the narrative, sometimes rather barren narrative of kings and battles. You're finding out about people writing about sex, about family feuds, about travel, about what they find funny. If you really want to understand a society, you've got to try and find out what they find funny, right? And this is where you might go for that.
Moving on chronologically now to the high and then the late Middle Ages, how would you say the sharing of knowledge changed? You've talked about the entrance of Aristotle into medieval scholarship in the 12th century, for example. How did that? Let's focus on the Roman and Greek inheritance. How did that begin to shift as we move closer towards the 14th or the 13th and 14th centuries?
Well, I think what's generally put under the label of humanism is important. The syllabus, as I've said, by the time you come to the 13th, 14th centuries, the standard syllabus in the universities is Aristotle. That's the learned people, philosophy, science, and so on. And that is basically the core. But particularly I think from the 14th century and into the 15th century, there are other learned people, writers, often writing in the vernacular, but also writing in Latin, who are doing something different. They're looking back to the Roman period. They're just as the people who are looking at Aristotle, they're looking back to an earlier period. But what they're looking to is what they see as the beautiful Latin that was written in the Roman Republic or the early days of the Roman Empire, Cicero and so on and so forth. And they take that as their model. So they're interested in the different parts of the syllabus. They're interested in rhetoric particularly. And so you get people, particularly in Italy, but also elsewhere, who have a different model of what the life of learning is all about. And sometimes they're very serious and they're talking about political thought and they're talking about morality. And sometimes they're interested in creating poetry, which we would call literature, whatever. You have to make a distinction. What's literature? Is it anything that's written down? No, it's normally where do you shelve it in the bookshop? So literature, and this is where you get some of the great names. Obviously, people like Dante and Petrarch and so on. These were people. They were not by any means. I wouldn't say they were hostile at all to the Aristotelian scientific philosophical model. They knew it, but they were trying to do something else. And they were also in a slightly different part of Europe, because in Italy you get cities that are more or less self-governing, wealthy cities that are more or less self-governing and running themselves with under the rule of more of lay people than of clergy, and people who had a very good education and people who were highly literate and people who knew about the commercial world. So you get this very different kind of style of learning. And then eventually that spreads, that Italian humanism spreads to other parts of Europe. And it means sometimes the symptoms of that are very, I don't know whether you call it superficial, but people start writing a different kind of Latin. They write Ciceronian Latin rather than medieval Latin and so on and so forth. They have a different kind of script. So on and so forth. Things like that. It's a style. It is a style. So that's the case. But also,
Sorry, you preempted my next question there, which is how much more important does the secular world become in terms of the preservation and the sharing of knowledge? You mentioned the Italian city-states there.
Yeah.
Is this purely a financial thing, or does it come from a secular desire to actually preserve and contain knowledge and fund universities?
Well, I think that there are sort of several aspects to it. I mean, I think by the time you get to the 16th century, it's not at all uncommon for the young members of the aristocracy, the lay aristocracy, to go to university, to know Latin and possibly Greek, and to be possibly authors in their own right. So you've got an enormous move towards, away from the domination of the clergy. I mean, it doesn't stop by any means. There's no question about that. It doesn't stop. But there is a shift in the balance between clerical and lay that takes place in the later Middle Ages and then onwards. And that is seen very clearly in the education of the upper class. And then, Aristotelianism really carries on as the standard fare in the universities. I mean, to generalize, probably up until the 17th century. And then, of course, we're into the scientific revolution, and you'll have to ask someone else about that.
have to arrange another interview.
The last thing I'd like to talk about really is the role of the church in all this. So we talked about the role of the church in the early Middle Ages, about preserving knowledge and the sharing of knowledge through monasteries, and then universities developing. But towards the end of what we call the Middle Ages, there's this kind of stereotypical view of the church actually being the preventer, the thing that prevents the development of learning. And the story of Galileo, for example, might be one there, which is often misinterpreted, I think. But would you better talk a bit about that and how this changing of scholarship and understanding the world, even writing in a different style of Latin, might have rubbed up against the status quo of religious practice and religious understanding?
Well, I think the starting point, if we're going to be very fundamental about it, is that Christianity, like Judaism and Islam, is a scriptural religion. It has a book that is supposedly divinely inspired, right? So you've got there a kind of set of principles, criteria, issues that are set. That's one of the things. How you interpret them, of course, the Bible's been interpreted in many, many different ways, but you've got there a criteria. So if people are saying things that aren't in the Bible or seem to contradict what's in the Bible, then you've actually got a fault line and a place where there's going to be pressure. Galileo was a rather curious example, because Galileo wasn't actually hauled up for saying something that wasn't really in the Bible, but more for saying something that wasn't in Aristotle. I mean, geocentric and the rest, geocentric theory, and whether there's a change in the superlunary world, all this kind of stuff, that's not really in the Bible, right? You get certain. I think there is a kind of a very interesting and probably slightly unresolved picture of what happens at the end of the Middle Ages and the very early modern period. In that simultaneously, the traditional thing was, of course, Renaissance, Italian Renaissance, new questions being answered, the new world, discoveries, etc., etc. At the same time, of course, it's also the time of the great witch hunts. This is simultaneous, right? There's no big pan-European witch hunts in the Middle Ages. They begin right at the end of the Middle Ages, and they carry on throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. And so you've got there a machinery of persecution which is imposing on its poor victims some astonishing ideas, the Sabbath and flying through the air and all this kind of stuff. At the same time as we're supposed to be having this rationalism and an opening up of the mind. And that seems to me a very hard thing to stick together. How do you picture those two things happening at the same time? And is there in any way a sort of a kind of a deep harmony between them? Is there anything going on there? So you've got those issues, And of course, suddenly, bang in the middle of it, you've got the Reformation and the fact that the unity of the Catholic Church, the Latin Church, is shattered forever, and that obviously makes one of the big differences. I mean, it seems to me that medievalists are always trying to, push the Middle Ages and try and stop people knocking it. But I do think that the very traditional view that round about 1500 there were some very big changes, and you have European world colonialism begins, you have printing, and you have the Reformation, and those are very traditional markers, and I think they're very good ones for saying that this world has now changed into a different world. Yeah, I do believe that.
Marking the end of the Middle Ages. One last thing is that, do you think that something as seismic as the Reformation, for example, that emerges from the Church's obsession with heresy, I suppose, in a way, does it not? And how do you think the Church had changed over the course of the Middle Ages? I mean, from my understanding, it seems to go from one where there's an obsession with reform and driving away opponents of the faith externally, such as what emerges as the Crusades, and then towards the end of the Middle Ages, it seems to turn inwards again, when there's this focus on heresy and dealing with different interpretations of the Scripture, as you just mentioned there.
Well, the issue of heresy, I mean, it's a lot of people have worked on heresy, and I'm probably going to parody, but there seem to be two schools of thought. One is that heresy was more or less made up by the Church, that there were people who in the Church who had a picture of this thing that was a threat, right, which they then elaborated on. And the other one was that there were a lot of people in Western Europe who disagreed with the Church and wanted to have an alternative. That's the other one. I myself, for what it's worth, tend to incline towards the second. I mean, I think the evidence is very strong that in certain places like Italy and southern France and so on and elsewhere, there were people who really disagreed with the teaching of the Church as they experienced it, and created alternative networks and so on. And that the Church's response is, in both pictures, the Church's response is persecution. And you have the creation of Inquisition and so on, and the idea of the heretics as the enemy within, and things like the Albigensian Crusade, in which you actually launch an army against Christians who disagree with you. I mean, this is all seems to me to be the case. It's a traditional view, but I think it's the case. And so you've already got a long tradition of an intolerant church. And then I suppose the big thing about Luther, I mean, is that Luther, if you can put it that simply, kind of Luther wins. I mean, there's still Lutherans today, right? And large parts of Europe. So the earlier movements of criticism of the Church and the suppression through heresy of heresy and so on, that's something that gets going in the 12th century, possibly a little bit earlier. And creates a machinery of persecution that then carries on right through way into the modern period, in fact. And it's, I mean, there's a book called The Birth of a Persecuting Society or something like that by Bob Moore, in which he sort of sees that. And there's no doubt about it that, the Church is not a tolerant institution in the Middle Ages. It has a position to defend, and when I say that a position, I mean both a social and a position of power in society, and also a series of intellectual positions that it really doesn't want to see undermined.
With the Reformation and the printing press being a natural endpoint, then let's finish by saying, is there any way in which the legacy of knowledge in the medieval world is with us at all today? Of course, I mean, it's perhaps a bit more difficult than talking about the same thing in the early modern world, where you mentioned we've still got Lutherans with us today. But is a medieval understanding of the world present in any way in today's society, would you say, or in today's society of scholarship and learning?
Well, I am retired now, but I was teaching in a university where teaching began in 1410. So I mean,
St Andrews, yeah.
St Andrews,
yeah,
the first Scottish university. So you've got continuity of certain kind of institutions. Yes, you have that. Naturally, what is taught is a little bit different, but the idea of getting loads of teenagers off somewhere and making them read and write and then testing them for knowledge and stuff, that's basic principle is there, right? We don't, and that of course is not simply medieval because it's a change in the Middle Ages. We don't send so many teenagers off to a life of monastic seclusion as we used to. I mean, there have been some big changes, but there are roots.
You just have to pay tuition fees now. You don't have to give your life to the church after going to university.
Exactly. But there are a lot of things around. I mean, if you could obviously list them. You know, the university I've just done, Parliament. Parliament is a medieval institution. The town, the legally constituted town. As distinct from simply a gathering of houses, but I think towns, universities, parliaments. I mean, there's still a few medieval things hanging around.
Well, Professor Bartlett, it's been a real pleasure talking to you. I could go on for hours and hours talking about these things with you. It's so interesting, and it's been a real joy to speak to you this afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us.
I've enjoyed it very much. Thank you.